Dr. Marty Makary, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Great to be with you, John.
So you reached out because you saw a clip from my interview with Jay Bhattacharya.
Good friend of mine.
And I saw you have a great new book, Blind Spots, When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health. And I come from a family of doctors. There are lots of blind spots. And I think most of us feel like the entire industry is blind spots for us because it feels opaque. It feels hard to understand. You have been at, in some ways, the commanding heights of this medical establishment. You're at Johns Hopkins, world-renowned hospital. You've been involved with the WHO and other big institutions, but you're critical. So I guess, why should I trust anyone in your field? Let's start there.
Well, great to see you. Good to be with you. So, trust is at an all-time low. A study just came out in one of our top journals measuring the amount of public trust, and it's about at 40% right now.
Yeah.
Women trust the system a little less than men, and folks in their sort of 25 to 40-year-old age group trust the medical establishment the least. A lot of people realize they've been lied to a lot. And historically, it's been with good intentions. And I think even recently, there was some good intentions, but there's this groupthink, herd mentality, bandwagon effect where every doctor's got to stay online saying the same message, which is okay if it's a message supported by good scientific evidence. But a lot of times it's a gut feeling from a couple political government doctors or establishment sort of oligarchs. We have our own priesthood in medicine.
Yep.
And with good intentions, they develop these giant blind spots, not just in recent COVID policy, but with so many major health recommendations. And that's why I'm excited about this book, Blind Spots. I wanted to educate people on where the medical establishment has gotten things tragically wrong, sometimes igniting epidemics. And then when they realize the science shows they got it wrong, they just kind of fade out. But they need to put out the same apology reversal with the same vigor they put out the initial recommendation, because people are very forgiving if doctors are honest with them.
Okay, I'll keep this quick. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so that you won't miss more Dad Saves America as our videos come out each week. And it also really helps us because when we reach out to guests, they look at how many subscribers there are to decide if they want to come on and share their ideas. So please subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out, and thanks for watching. Now, back to the show. I think one of the things that we got a front row seat to was the trials and tribulations of epidemiology. So obviously with COVID, we came into this thing and epidemiology became the word everybody had to figure out how to pronounce consistently, number one. You, as I understand it, you're an abdominal surgeon, deal with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So you're interacting with this thing that seems to, at any given time, have a bunch of causes that may turn out to still be a cause next year or not. Like eggs cause cancer, coffee causes cancer. No, eggs are not bad for cancer. Like this causes cancer feels like the first place where I get worried that I'm being told nonsense. You know, X causes cancer. Now, meat's carcinogenic. Oh, no, it's not. So how do I understand, help me understand like what causes cancer, who to look to for that?
Well, first of all, we don't have good studies around the key issues on health. We don't study the environmental exposures that cause cancer, just the chemotherapy to treat it. Maybe we need to treat more diabetes with cooking classes instead of just throwing insulin at people. Maybe we need to talk about school lunch programs, not just putting every kid on Ozempic. So we get in this sort of tunnel mentality and we, measure things in these silos. And medicine has become so fragmented. Again, not because we have bad people in the system. Every doctor I know generally wants to do the right thing always or tries to. But it's such a fragmented system and we glorify this hyper specialization and we have this sort of ladder in the academic chain where you go up the ladder by making a lot of money for the hospital and having a tiny focus in the human body. So we've got 82 specialties. They're not talking to each other. And guess what? The whole body is connected. Every cell has some of the same receptors in mitochondrial physiology. General body inflammation affects every organ system. We've forgotten about the microbiome. We don't talk about food as medicine. So these are the areas where, if we're going to truly understand health and be honest with people, we've got to redirect our focus, get away from this hyper specialization as the only legitimate form of academic achievement, and refund our research dollars. The NIH is funding $80 billion. What are we getting for it? Well, how did it perform during COVID?
Not great. It
Yeah.
seems like, I mean, the question of how to do research, I want to come back to that
Okay.
because it's there one of the things I've noticed in your writings, and you've written several books on healthcare pretty broadly. So not so you've talked about the system writ large, and the way it creates a lot of waste, um, and about these blind spots, these areas where maybe through specialization, and other incentives, we aren't being given great advice, or maybe even doctors aren't keeping up with what is the most current thinking on any particular area. But to come back to cancer.
You're being polite, I can tell. Not great advice. We give totally wrong advice for on low fat food for 70 years. We got the opioids are non addictive wrong for 30 years, igniting the opioid crisis. We got peanut allergies wrong for 17 years, igniting the modern day peanut day epidemic. We got hormone replacement therapy wrong we still have it wrong for 22 years for postmenopausal women, creating needless suffering. And we still have so many major health recommendations wrong, not because anyone's diabolical, but because the science caught up with the opinion makers and it's proven them wrong. And there's no humility. And how do you teach humility in a profession of scientific might? And that is, it turns out, what the public is hungry for: some degree of honesty, coming around full circle, reconciling all the misinformation that's been put out there. In the case of COVID, I think one of the greatest perpetrators of misinformation was the United States government.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
why do you say that from your perspective? Because everybody feels that way to varying degrees, except for the people that are still driving their cars alone with masks on, which is like, we live in bizarre times. But
well, I mean, the entire response was a giant catastrophe. We're not talking about just making a rash decision in an emergency. That's forgivable. But for 3 years insisting a toddler has to wear a cloth mask, for 2 years insisting the schools have to be closed, ignoring natural immunity, one of the most scientifically, intellectually dishonest things they could put out there. And they openly told me when I met with them privately, it was so people wouldn't be hesitant to get vaccinated. That's why they ignored it. They were dishonest with the public. They were dishonest on boosters and young, healthy kids with myocarditis, with not letting family members visit their dying loved ones in the hospital for 2 years. That's a human rights violation. And so it was the entire response. They were making it up as they go. They crushed anyone who was out of line, and they teach the general culture in medicine of the medical elites, and that is stay in line, be obedient, don't disagree with us, don't say anything publicly, and if so, we're going to come after you. And as a result, we had a COVID outcome at the end of the 3.5 year epidemic was almost twice as bad as that in Sweden. You look at the hard numbers.
So at the time that COVID first kicks in early 2020, I had happened to have just finished making a video with an organization called AIER, which would later publish the Great Barrington Declaration.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so, sort of economic research, the heads of it at the time were good friends of mine, and so I had a little bit of a front row seat to what they were writing, because they were on the bleeding edge of saying this is a bunch of crazy talk, this lockdown talk. They were the first folks to actually be writing about a friend of mine, Jeffrey Tucker.
Tucker, I love him.
Yeah, he wrote pieces about how in 1968 at Woodstock there was a Was it there was a flu? I forget. It was I think it originated in Asia, actually, the Hong Kong flu. That there was a Hong Kong flu that had killed 500,000
You're
people.
racist.
And yeah, of
Okay.
course. Yes. Yes. How dare I? How dare I and everyone ever up until 5 minutes ago label the source,
Right.
the
Right.
virus based on the origin.
Right.
But so they were writing about this stuff. And so I personally was pretty quick to notice that Sweden was doing things differently, and it made a lot more sense.
Mhm.
But I also probably maybe lucked out on that. Why was Sweden so alone in being able to say, you know what, we're going to protect the people who are really in the risk profile, elderly, multiple comorbidities, and we're going to let the rest of society more or less get on with it. And if you want to stay in your house, that's up to you, but we're not telling you you have to. And here we are now. The jury seems to be in on that across every metric: schools, student performance, um, all cause mortality after the fact, which
Yeah.
seems to be some weird stuff going on there. Like, why do we have elevated mortality after it's over? What's going on there?
Yep.
There's like, at one level, this is the topic everybody's talked about to death. At another level, there doesn't seem to have been any medical establishment come to Jesus on it. So what's going on there?
Fauci is still getting standing ovations at medical conferences. And I think there's an illusion of consensus that was created by him and the other patriarchs that other countries in Europe and other countries around the world, not all of them, but many of them just assumed these are the experts. The media granted Dr. Fauci a title that he did not deserve, which was the nation's top infectious diseases doctor. He's not an infectious diseases doctor. He did not do an infectious diseases fellowship training. He's not board certified in infectious diseases. Now, it doesn't mean he can't have an opinion. I value his input like every other person out there in science. But the idea that this guy somehow would know better than anyone else whether or not the virus spread from surface transmission or airborne, no. The other two coronaviruses that cause severe illness in humans, SARS and MERS, were both airborne. Why would the third one, COVID, suddenly buck the trend? And he was telling teachers to wear goggles and gloves, not at the beginning of the pandemic, but 6 months into it. I mean, if you have the budget, just answer all these controversies in real time instead of opining on television. But the illusion of consensus was created. Francis Collins famously called the Washington Post and said, people spreading misinformation are resulting in lost lives and they need to be brought to justice. Right. And so at the same time, they're talking about the wet market being the origin. They still believe that, Collins and Fauci. Not even the Chinese believe that. It's that outrageous.
How do you know? What do you mean? Because
The Chinese CDC has said they do not believe it comes from the wet market.
they have.
Yeah. So, I mean, everyone, people are so angry at folks for not complying with cloth masks. The president at the time that COVID hit was not wearing a cloth mask frequently enough. And people were thinking, if he just wore a cloth mask, we could end this pandemic because he'd be a role model. I mean, looking back on the absurdity of we need to hire 500,000 contact tracers, right? These horrific policies, the people that bore the worst restrictions and the untold story of the pandemic was its impact on poor and minority communities in the United States. So all these oligarchs and patriarchs in the ruling class had it pretty nice. If they dodged COVID, if they were relatively healthy, they were in their pajamas doing Zoom calls all day long. Meanwhile, in inner city Baltimore, where I work, kids never logged on to an iPad and they never showed up in school again. We already have an incredible dropout rate. The poverty level affected an estimated 100 million people worldwide.
Yep.
Right. So these were the policies where is a total disaster.
The One of the things that seems to be part of this is a culture in medicine. And it maybe even goes back to the Hippocratic Oath, which everyone understands to be this sort of plead to do no harm but also has sort of other parts of it that are protective of the guild of doctors. And again, my biases are pro doctor because my dad's a doctor and I've come from a family of
Yeah,
doctors.
yeah, Philadelphia.
But there is a don't go on the internet and do your own research. Please don't come into my office and ask me too many questions. I'm the doctor, you're the patient. Vibe, culture.
Yeah.
And the thing that I think a lot of people experience that breaks that is when they encounter an instance where they know in their body something's wrong
Mm-hmm.
and they're being told things to the contrary of what they're feeling. And they turn out to be right.
Yes.
So talk to me about the culture of medicine as you see it. Am I onto something here? Is there a kind of condescension that's baked into medicine that needs to change?
Well, first of all, rank and file doctors, and I go to medical conferences all the time. I get the privilege of speaking at so many medical organizations. They're amazing people. They're creative, altruistic. Many of them think independently. But then a subset have this blind allegiance, and they don't recognize this culture of obedience that's imposed on us, which is really this culture of intense paternalism.
Yeah.
When women were able to get home pregnancy tests, when the technology was there, the medical establishment fought it hard. Women can't handle this information. When HIV had a test where you could test to see if you were positive, the medical establishment for over a decade insisted, nearly 2 decades, we cannot let people get tested on their own. We have to test them, and then they have to come in for an appointment where we tell them the results. Same thing with home COVID testing that we were calling for at the beginning. You see this incredible paternalism come
Yes.
out, and you've got to recognize that there is a groupthink. And even with good intentions, you've got to be able to be objective and stand back and ask, hey, are we doing this the right way? Because it's not just COVID. COVID was a little peek into the medical establishment. And there is this people are so dumb out there, we have to lie to them in order to achieve our goals. And you see that in very subtle forms. Like I remember one of my mentors, Gino Murley, in Philadelphia. He was a hematologist, and he was teaching us just before we went into the hospital in medical school, right before the 3rd year. And he said, amazing teacher, he said, should you ever lie as a doctor?
Hmm.
And we're looking around at each other like, of course not. No, this is an easy one. No. And he said, you will be amazed at the number of times that you will be encouraged or conditioned to lie. And it really stuck with me. I told my dad, and he was a doc, and he was like, yeah, remember that. That's a real thing. Within 24 hours, I was in the emergency room, and a doc said, write that their oxygen saturation is 70% to make sure the insurance company pays for it. And immediately I was conditioned. I was like, no, wait a minute. So when they were ignoring natural immunity and I talked to them about it, they said, well, people are basically, they didn't use this word, too stupid to understand it. Could create vaccine hesitancy, they said. Same thing with the booster recommendation. Hey guys, this is a little crazy. 7 COVID vaccine doses in a healthy 12-year-old girl? I don't think so. I don't think that is supported with any randomized control trial. And what I was told, and I wrote a piece on this, why people don't trust the CDC in Newsweek, they decided you have to have one message because the public is too stupid to understand age cutoffs for the vaccine. This is not my opinion. This was in the CDC recommendation deliberation committee that's public. And I attended that thing virtually. And they said over and over again, the top oligarchs with all the big titles, you have to keep it simple, one message for all, no discussion of the data, and it's not supported, and there's myocarditis risk, which they downplayed. So that level of medical paternalism still very much is present in our oligarchy. And that's why you want a doctor who has the ability to say, I don't know when we don't know. That was the right answer a lot of times in COVID. To say, I know my limits and there's another guy who may know more about this. So you want to take these vitamins or you want to do a cleanse or you talk about the microbiome. I really don't know a lot about that. Maybe there's something to it. Here's somebody that might know, or here's some resources. It's not well studied. That's the level of humility that people are hungry for, because this arrogance has not just been with COVID. It's been with so many major health recommendations that have gone wrong in the modern era, and people still have it wrong in many instances.
Where are we getting it wrong the worst right now, in your opinion?
I think probably one of the biggest screw ups of modern medicine was to demonize what we call hormone replacement therapy for women who go through menopause. If a woman starts hormone replacement therapy, that is estrogen plus or minus progesterone, within 10 years of going through menopause, they will on average live 3.5 years longer. Their rate of heart attacks gets cut in half. They alleviate many or all of their symptoms of menopause, which can linger for nearly a decade. And if they fall or are in a car accident, they're half as less likely to break a bone, and broken bones later in life result in immobility and a cascade of events.
Osteoporosis is a big challenge for women as they age, right?
That's right. And the most important thing in reducing the risk of osteoporosis, and by the way, for some reason, Black women don't get osteoporosis. It's exceedingly rare. Their bones are strong. It's interesting. But there's nothing more effective in treating osteoporosis than starting hormone replacement therapy for a woman when they start menopause or within the first 10 years of onset. And the kicker is the cognitive decline that is known to happen after menopause, typically 45 to 57 years of age is when a woman will start experiencing perimenopause. That cognitive decline, sometimes a short-term brain fog, sometimes it lingers, or an increased risk of dementia, but the cognitive decline associated with the postmenopausal period, that goes down by 50 to 60%. Wow. Women are more coherent and sharper. And the risk of Alzheimer's goes down by 35% in one of the major observational studies. These are in major journals. There's no medication, and it can be a patch or a pill. I don't work for the company. I don't get paid, but there's no intervention in the modern era that improves the health of a population more, with the exception of maybe the discovery of antibiotics, than hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women. You would think with this overwhelming set of health outcomes that improves with HRT, why aren't women getting it? 90% of doctors will not recommend it because a doctor at the NIH about 22 years ago, who was, in my opinion, the Dr. Fauci of his day, announced at a press conference that he believes it causes breast cancer based on a study he conducted. That study was not released. And when I did the investigation on this, I talked to him, I tracked him down in retirement, and it turns out that that study never showed an increased rate of breast cancer. It was never statistically significant, but he believed that it did in his gut.
So he's just a liar then. He actually did a study. It didn't have an outcome. I don't know. I think, like, where's he? Why would you do that? Is he like, what, you talked to him? Did you ask him, like, why would you say something that your own study didn't even suggest? Like, was there some theory that, he was in love with that? Well, the data will eventually conform to my theory, like a lot of soft sciences love to say.
Well, he tried to talk around me. He tried to talk over me with statistics, tried to point me to other studies. When I would pick apart those other studies, he would then point to his own study. When I would pick apart his own study, he would bring up other arguments. I found that he had written years prior to the study that we have to stop the HRT bandwagon. So he was on a mission. He just had a deeply entrenched view. It's part of the whole psychology of why we stick and defend what we hear first, as opposed to being open-minded and objective. Entire careers were built on this. This was the largest study in the history of medicine. The most $1 billion from the NIH in taxpayer dollars went to this study.
His study.
And he recruited top researchers from Harvard and Stanford and all over the place. And in lockstep, under his command, they put this out there. Now, a lot of those people kind of faded out. They weren't part of the announcement. They were kind of cut out. It's an amazing backstory. The meeting he held right before the announcement, a couple bold, smart doctors said, "What the heck are you saying here? That's not supported by the data. And if you misrepresent the study like that, saying that hormone therapy causes breast cancer when it doesn't, you may do incredible damage and you may never be able to undo it, because when you talk about something as sensitive as breast cancer and suggest that something causes it from the NIH with such rigor and absolutism, you may never be able to, quote, put that genie back in the bottle," is what one of them told him in the shouting match in that meeting. And he went ahead and did it anyway. And to this day, 50 million American women, including my mother, have been denied the incredible health benefits of hormone replacement therapy because of that announcement.
So we are in what I think might be the most unprecedented thing about our life right now in 2024, in this time, is the age of the population of America and the West, and really the planet, but especially the first world, the rich world. We have never had this many old people relative to young, this many people living as long as we have. So you're talking about therapies that are impacting just tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people worldwide. I imagine that when there's a consensus position like this in the United States, that it echoes around the world.
It did, totally. The day that doctor made the announcement, misrepresenting the data, saying with such absolutism that hormone replacement therapy causes breast cancer, women flushed their estrogen pills down the toilet worldwide. The use went down by 90% overnight. Doctors began calling their patients, telling them, "Hey, stop this medication. We're worried about breast cancer." And it was the classic groupthink. Did anyone stop and actually read the study and get down to the table? And I do all this investigation in the book Blind Spots and look at the actual numbers and the statistical test we call an odds ratio with the confidence intervals to see whether or not it was significant. It took on a life of its own. And it's sort of the classic cognitive dissonance. And it's true of a lot of things. The low-fat diet, one of the big people that propagated the misinformation of the food pyramid from the government, again,
Yep.
government misinformation, they said to me, "Well, the American Heart Association is saying this. Are you mean to tell me they're wrong and the Surgeon General's office is wrong and the American College of Cardiology is wrong and the American Nutrition?" And I'm like, yeah, it's a house of cards. It was based on dogma. It's not. And they were like, "Well, I just can't believe that all these people are wrong." I don't think so, were her words.
We had a great conversation with Peter Boghossian, you know, philosopher of thought
Yeah.
and of rhetoric and of argument. And he I think he coined this term idea laundering. And that is for this academic process by which you have some idea, you put it through a peer-reviewed journal. That peer-reviewed journal is filled with your friends
Yeah.
who are doing the same thing, and you're on a different journal, and so you're basically in this money laundering, but with ideas operation
Right.
that produces what looks like a bunch of scientific consensus,
Yes.
but is nonsense. It's just complete gobbledygook that you made up for whatever reason, or that you think is true, but is pretty weak sauce from a methodological standpoint, and that it just gets accepted. And then like Friedrich Hayek calls it the secondhand dealers of information, the press, artists, bloggers, the media. They run with barely the abstract on the first page. Like, oh, X causes Y. Yes. Not only it's a crisis. The X equals Y crisis.
Yeah.
Is all you hear in the news. Meanwhile, even the paper doesn't say that. Is that happening in medicine? Is there an idea laundering process, or because that would suggest a lot of corruption in things like the Lancet and Nature and these journals that have been referred to as these standard bearers of peer review and scientific rigor?
Well, first of all, everyday health professionals are good people and they're not doing anything diabolical. But we do have this elite establishment that gets drunk in their own cronyism and didn't even realize that they generate these massive blind spots. And what they're saying is often medical dogma. It's not scientific evidence, it's dogma that takes on a life of its own, is put out there with an illusion of consensus, propagated by the medical journals sometimes. You saw, immediately after a reporter found out that the NIH was funding the Wuhan virology lab.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately, the NIH was scrambling and they were doing all kinds of stuff, emergency meetings and calls and, contact me on my Gmail and off the record and all this stuff. And they got a bunch of the virologists who have the big academic credentials to write a puff piece in the major journals to say it did, from our analysis, it did not come from. And this is
the lab leak.
The lab leak. And, that has a life of its own, that whole story. But you saw the same kind of thing. Well, if like that woman who did the food pyramid, well, you mean to tell me all these people are wrong? I don't think so. And so they went out there and put out stuff in the journals. And sometimes people think, oh, it's in a medical journal, therefore it's evidence. No. And there's not a lot of difference between a commentary in a medical journal and writing a blog and having some comments, do the peer review underneath it. And I think we live in a scary time right now in the medical profession where if a study shows a conclusion that you like, even if it's flawed methodology, then it's held up as scientific evidence. And if a study gives you a result you don't like, people ignore it and discredit it, and oftentimes journals won't publish it. My research team at Johns Hopkins is focused on the biggest topics in medicine that we are not talking about, that we need to be talking about. And that's what's led us down this road of talking about price gouging and predatory billing of patients after hospitals care for them, the quality problem, the cost problem, our drug pricing problem, how we fund research in the United States, what we research, what are the blind spots in our understanding of health, like the microbiome. So these are topics that don't get airtime with the old belts and suspenders professors that are, controlling the journals. And by the way, you need term limits. You need fresh young people in these positions, or at least new people in these positions. People serve tenures at the NIH and at the medical journals like a ancient Spanish monarch or an African president. I mean, they'll be there for 30, 40, 50 years in these
like
jobs.
Fauci.
I don't want to say it, but
decades and decades in the same spot.
I mean, you look at his leadership at NIAID, head of virology, senior scientist. These people are all in their 70s and 80s. They've been there forever. Do you really think they're going to have the fresh ideas? Now, if they were open to fresh ideas, that'd be one thing, but we saw them call for a devastating takedown, shutting out these, spreading misinformation. That's the great irony, is that they sort of get this tunnel mentality.
You use this term medical dogma.
Yes.
What do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. Because there's so much complexity in medicine and in the body and in the things that contribute to health and well-being. So what is the source of a dogmatic view?
Well, I don't want people to get suspicious of their doctor. If you have a doctor that's listening to you, honest with you, knows their limits, works as a team, says, I don't know, and that's the right answer, those are good doctors, and that's most doctors. But what we have is a medical establishment in the United States that issues dogma, and it takes on a life of its own, and nobody questions it. And if you do, you're kind of told to get in line. We have so much dogma in medicine. Anyone that has gone through a medical residency or training, Bob Marley came in with a discolored toe, and it turns out it was melanoma. But the dogma at the time was that Black people do not get melanoma. It was just a dogma. Now, somebody made it up. These things just run in generations through the folklore of medicine. And they told him it was a bruise, and he died in his 30s of melanoma. We have so much of that. You have to give 2 units of blood if you're going to give blood. You can't give 1 unit. The blood supply was totally safe through the 1980s. We heard that over and over again. We basically killed a generation of Americans with severe hemophilia. You didn't even see them in the hospital for like 20 years later, because most of them had died from the dogma that the blood supply was safe, even though doctors 6 years before the blood was routinely tested for HIV were saying, hey, flag, there's people with IV drug use coming in with HIV, or at least the AIDS constellation of symptoms. How do you think they got it? Probably bloodborne. Let's play it safe and screen. And they were told, you're being a racist, homophobic, you can't screen blood based on criteria. And that story was an incredible story. The dogma that opioids are non-addictive. The FDA.
How did that ever be a thing that anyone said? Is it? I don't mean to like laugh at it, but it's like the most addictive. I mean, it's like definitionally addictive. It's like poppy.
Yes, it's like
doesn't
opioids, the opioid wars of China, and
right.
It's like
this is not new information that opioids are highly addictive substances. So how would that even be a thing that anyone takes seriously?
The groupthink at the time was that we don't treat pain well enough as a profession. And while that may have been true, and I think it was true, there was this sort of bandwagon thinking, and the dogma became just give these things out. So one guy in New England who's buddies with the New England Journal editors, which you talk about a group of like-minded monarchs and oligarchs. This is an editorial board of 51 people that just as of a couple of years ago had 1 African American. These are friends, and they're in the little New England culture, and they all went to the same residencies and in their Harvard system. They published an article in 1980, I think it was, that declared that only out of 30-some thousand people someone had treated, only 1 had developed dependence. And they published this in the New England Journal. Now, granted,
seems like a big sample size. So what was wrong with this?
Well, what was wrong was this doc was in the hospital. How would he know if somebody's addicted outside of the hospital? He's giving him opioids in a hospital setting. And then he's like, I haven't seen any of my patients get addicted. Yeah, some are dead and some are not coming back to see you. And some you don't see patients outside of that hospital setting. And so this letter became known as in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was established that opioids are not addictive. I was told that in my residency. I mean, if you want me to be 100% honest with you, I feel terrible. I gave out opioids like candy after surgery. I had no idea I was taught in residency this dogma. I remember one time writing 30 opioid pills after an abdominal surgery. And the senior resident told me, what are you doing? No, write 90. That way they don't come back and bother us for more. Well,
so you're giving people like 3 months of on a script of what would it be, like Oxycontin, or what would be a typical
oxycodone, Percocet, Vicodin.
Okay.
I mean, when it came out what was happening, our research team, which again, we focus on the big things in medicine no one else is working on, we immediately, as a rapid response team of researchers, dispatched on this topic. And we met with every type of doctor saying, after childbirth, what is a reasonable amount of opioids? Not just what do you do, but what is the true expert? How much do they really need? And many times they'd say 3, 0. After a knee operation, somebody is narcotic naive, what should they be getting on that script? You don't know if they're going to need it or not. What's the appropriate initial script? And we came up with these guidelines that were a third or a quarter of what was actually in practice at the time. And you have to do it that way because when the governments get involved, they say, well, there's a ceiling number for any opioid script, no matter what. Well, what if you have your chest cracked open in open heart surgery? It's more painful than an ingrown toenail. So the government didn't handle this very well, but neither did the medical profession. And there's no humility with it. Now, I wrote in The Price We Pay, my prior book, very honestly about how terrible when I realized the dependence out there. But why did the medical establishment take 35 years to do the simple study looking at patients after surgery, minor surgery, given an opioid? How many are still taking it at 3 months when they really don't have pain? That number was 1 in 16. That study from the University of Michigan was our wake-up call that not only were we missing something, we had ignited an epidemic from medical dogma in the United States, an epidemic that did not exist in other countries around the world.
So this, you lay at the feet of that dogmatic New England Journal of Medicine, sort of the kindling for the what we're experiencing now with opioids.
Yeah, Purdue Pharma gets all the blame, and they are as guilty as anyone. I mean, they were putting lies out there and brainwashing docs and manipulating them, but we all have a piece of the pie. We doctors should have been asking more questions. Our journals had misled us. Pharma had fanned the flame and encouraged us by lying to us. And when you take a step back, I think in healthcare, we like to play the blame game. And the reality is we all have a piece of the pie. And that's the same with today's healthcare cost crisis. You can blame pharma and you can blame insurers and lawyers and hospital administrators. We all have a piece of the pie. We can all do better. And we need a comprehensive approach, not just give me more money for my little stakeholder group.
I want to go to the systemic questions, some of the economics of healthcare. But before I do, I want to ask about a couple other pieces that you've already referenced. One of which is the microbiome.
Yeah.
So, you did a TED talk about this a couple of years ago, or you touched on it, and it was, I think it was 3 years ago. So it was after COVID had begun. And you said there's another pandemic that's in progress and much slower going with the much less sexy pathogen of bacteria, and that we are overprescribing antibiotics and it is giving rise to essentially superbugs. And we're also bombing the heck out of our stomachs and disrupting our microbiome. So help me understand that this is something my wife has talked to me about for years because, I've taken a fair amount of antibiotics for this or that. And she's always like, you don't need that. What is that? That's some broad spectrum antibiotic. That's not good. What should I understand as a layperson about antibiotics and the relationship to the microbiome?
Well, antibiotics do save lives. C-sections save lives, but they're both massively overused and they're altering the microbiome in everyday Americans. And we are learning more and more about this incredible organ system, a garden of billions of different bacteria that line the gastrointestinal tract that are involved in absorption of food. They train the immune system. They produce vitamins, even GLP-1 in low levels, the active ingredient in Ozempic. It's naturally produced by some bacteria in the microbiome.
It's a peptide, is that right? GLP-1?
It's a peptide and it mimics a natural hormone in the body.
Okay.
It reduces appetite and other things. And it produces serotonin, which is involved in your mood and mental health. So we know there are these connections molecularly with the microbiome and so many organ systems, probably every organ system. But we really have not had research interest, NIH funding centers, and honestly, the technology to study it. How do you study millions of different bacteria? Turns out now we're understanding they live in harmony. And when you carpet bomb some of the microbiome, like antibiotics do, other bacteria can overgrow and they can be pro-inflammatory bacteria that overgrow. They can be dangerous bacteria that, while suppressed in the gut, they're safe, but when they overgrow can be deadly, like C. diff is the most well-known infection that we see in the hospital that overgrows. So an amazing study was done at the Mayo Clinic. And this, in my opinion, was the most significant study of the last 10 years in medicine. It got almost no attention. Hardly any doctor I talked to at Johns Hopkins has heard of this study, but I was amazed by it. So what they did is they looked at kids who had taken an antibiotic in the first few years of life, 10,000 of them, and compared them to children who did not take an antibiotic in the first few years of life, about 4,000 of them. And the Mayo Clinic researchers and this guy, Marty Blaser, who's the world expert on the microbiome, looked at diseases these children developed later. Kids who took an antibiotic were more likely to be obese, to have learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, asthma, and things like celiac, which was like almost 300% higher in kids who had taken an antibiotic. So what's happening? We don't know for certain that there is a cause and effect relationship based on the study, but it suggests there is because there was a dose-dependent relationship. In other words, the more courses of antibiotics the kid was given, the increased risk of obesity and asthma and these other chronic diseases.
And how did the study know that there wasn't a bunch of other stuff going on? Because when I hear these sort of large scale studies that track people over long periods of time, I just think about from a practical perspective, 4,000 kids that didn't get. So how do we know for certain they didn't get the antibiotics? Is it just their parents saying, no, I don't think it was ever given to them? I know medical records are pretty hard to keep track of. I move, I get a new doctor in the new town. Do the files come? I wasn't keeping track of these files. Like it's this, we talk about some of these things like there's this digital record following us around and everyone knows everything about it, but it's quite opaque, this information. So why do you have confidence in this?
Yeah, generally it's hard to do these studies, and there's something you're referring to, which is important, called a healthy user bias effect. So in these observational studies, it may just be that the healthier kids are in one group and the less healthy kids are in the other group. So regardless of what they did, you're just looking at the healthy user bias. I don't think that was the case in this study for a couple of reasons. Number one, they looked at kids that are in one county in Minnesota, very little transit, one central system of medical records, and they tracked these pharmacy prescriptions in Olmsted County, Minnesota, where the Rochester-based Mayo Clinic is located. And they matched the kids healthy based on demographics as in the study. And the study has been repeated by a Danish group in 1 million kids and found similar results.
Oh, okay. So it's actually replicated.
It's been replicated, and the dose-dependent relationship, the more antibiotics you took, the higher the risk of these conditions, makes sense. It suggests a cause and effect. And farmers have been noticing this forever. Antibiotics given to animals raised for food are fatter. And so that's what tipped off.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's why they give it generally as a routine. Now, if an animal's sick, they can get an antibiotic, but the routine use of antibiotics in agriculture is to fatten up the animals. So Marty Blaser.
I've come across this because, my wife and I did this documentary at the Fork in which we actually traveled the country and met with producers, basically land-based animal producers. So dairy cows and beef cattle, broiler hens, and then and egg producers, pigs, which is the most horrific part of the pigs and the egg.
I don't eat pig.
Oh, it's not good. It's not a good deal.
Yeah.
And yeah, everybody talked about the overuse of antibiotics in the farming system and the fact that it gets into the water supply, it gets into our food. Like you, even in your TED Talk, I think referenced that if something north of 60% of all the antibiotics produced get consumed by the animals that we end up eating.
That's right. So when we talk about resistant bugs, these super bugs where no antibiotic works on them because the bug has evolved around the antibiotic, it's gotten smart. So if you have a million bacteria and you give antibiotics, one may have a genetic mutation where the antibiotic won't work. It won't activate the surface molecule that it needs to kill that bacteria or whatever the mutation might be. And then that one then populates that whole open field. And that's how resistant bacteria, every few months, there's an outbreak of E. coli. There was just one of listeria in boar's head sliced meat. And so these outbreaks, there's a number of reasons for them, but the resistant bacteria that spawn out of the food industry is a threat to public health. And so why are we giving all these animals antibiotics that they don't need? They're not sick. Now, people sometimes think, I don't want to be eating the antibiotic. That's not the real concern here. It's not like hormones, where we think the hormones in food are the reason driving puberty age down in
Bovine
women.
growth hormone, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, why do we don't need that? I choose hormone-free, routine use of antibiotic-free foods, organic, when I make my purchases. And I think if enough people ask for that at restaurants and at grocery stores, then the market moves. It responds to that, and that's what we need to do. But the fact that animals are fatter, when I don't know if that's politically incorrect, since it's
a statement of fact.
It's a statement of fact.
I mean, it is fat cells, right? That's what we call them, right? Fat cells.
Yeah, fat cells.
What do I know?
Yeah, fat cells, right?
I mean, like when you're in medical school, it's fat cells you're talking about, right?
Well, I find it seems like acceptable to use the term with animals, but with humans, not. So anyway,
I have more fat cells here. This is fat cells. Okay.
Oh, you're in shape. You don't need to worry about anything. I'm an expert in fat, and you're definitely not fat. So they noticed if the animals are getting more obese or fatter, are humans who take antibiotics also getting more obese? And that was the basis for this Mayo Clinic study. That was the hypothesis. So there's a mechanism there that makes sense. And then the other thing that messes up the microbiome, well, we think ultra-processed foods, a lot of refined carbohydrates, the simple sugars not bound to fiber, not like in fruit, but we're talking about
fruit juice.
Fruit juice has this, the high fructose corn syrup or straight sugar. It doesn't matter if it's cane or it's just straight sugar.
White bread.
White bread is refined flour. It functions with a high glycemic load, like a big sugar load. These are foods that are terrible. It gave us food comas as kids after lunch at school. Everyone blew it off. The food industry was controlling the nutritionists.
The Wonder Bread peanut butter and jelly sandwich, basically a candy bar.
Yeah, with a tiny bit of nutrition, and it's mostly from the peanuts and not from the bread it's like a burger, a good healthy burger. The bad part of it is not the meat. Sometimes it's the bun, right? Because it's made from refined flour. But anyway, as we relearn what increases our glycemic levels, and it could be different from everybody, it does make sense that some people exercise and work out like crazy and can't lose weight like others. Their microbiomes may have been altered. And a study just came out in JAMA Surgery. These are not little, tiny journals no one's heard of.
So that's the Journal of the American Medical Association, right? JAMA.
Yes, okay. Yes. Journal of the Medical Association. Kids who were born by C-section were more likely to have colon cancer before age 50. Colon cancer is going up in people under 50.
Yeah.
Young people. They found an association with being born by C-section.
What would be the mechanism there?
Well, when you're in utero, the gut is sterile. But when a baby your microbiome has to be formed by some exposure to bacteria. It has to be seeded. And when a baby is born through a natural delivery, it's the passage through the vaginal canal, the birth canal, where the bacteria seed the microbiome in the child. And then it's augmented by colostrum, breast milk, and kisses, and grandparents, and everyone holding it. But when you're born by C-section, a baby is sterile, extracted from a sterile operative field, and may not have bacteria from the mother or skin seeding its microbiome. It may be seeded by bacteria that normally live in the hospital. And so there's a different microbiome, and that's why we've known that these kids are more likely to have asthma, inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease are new diseases. They never existed before antibiotics. And when the guy who invented antibiotics, Alexander Fleming, received his Nobel Prize in the 1940s, he had issued a stern warning about overusing antibiotics and them being resulting in resistant bacteria, which would reset the clock. Because the only reason we have the modern white coat era of medicine is that we had antibiotics. Doctors used to be not disrespected in society. They were respected, but like a barber.
Right.
Matter of fact, barbers who would pull your teeth, and surgeons had the same name. They were called surgeon barbers in England. And we had a lancet. So like when George Washington gets pneumonia, they sit there with the lancet. Do we phlebotomize them or not? Yeah, let's go ahead and do it. Let's take a pint out. And they cut them and they bleed them out. That was like the only
bloodletting.
Bloodletting. It was like the only thing for centuries. So we didn't really have many tools, and doctors, like I said, weren't disrespected, but all of a sudden with the discovery of penicillin and the mass production in the post-World War II era, doctors now had the ability to prescribe something magical that could cure you, that could make childbirth safe, that could enable an operation. Antibiotics ushered in the white coat era of medicine and a strong paternalistic medical culture that insisted you had to go to some elite college just to be allowed to study medicine. You had to go to the elite college first,
Right.
and then we'd allow you. It was all white men. They ushered in this white coat era where there was an unquestioned authority of physicians. And they started keeping people in the hospital for weeks after, minor procedures. They would separate babies at birth from their mothers immediately. So they would take the baby to the back area and then in a nursery for an average of 10 days in the 1950s and 60s.
They would separate you from your baby for 10 days?
10 days. It went down to like 3 days in the 1970s. I still remember my little sister was born. Mom, well, I was at home.
What about bonding and oxytocin and all the stuff that they just not doing that?
There's something magical about bonding. Now we know the best practices, and the studies have caught up. Moms should be holding their babies skin to skin for hours. There should be a delayed clamping of the cord. The cord is giving stem cells and fetal hemoglobin and nutrients and antibodies to the baby. Let it pulsate when the baby is born for a minute or two. They've done studies showing that if you let it pulsate for 90 seconds instead of 45, you get more health benefits to the baby, lower rates of NICU utilization. The babies do better. Their blood pressure and heart rate's better controlled. Even their blood glucose level is better when the moms hold the baby, what we call kangaroo care, for hours, because this took me a minute to figure out, but the baby's hormones are not spiking. These stress hormones were striking when the mom's...
Cortisol and things like that.
Cortisol. So when the baby is not being held by the mom, these stress hormones are changing its glucose metabolism. So all of this research is basically getting us back to the ancient biblical principles of, relationships, community. We're rediscovering fasting and meditation and whole foods and clean meats. But in the world of childbirth, the white coat era of medicine took this very paternalistic approach of separating kids so we could go back and probe and pry and, the baby. Yeah, when my little sister was born, I remember asking Mom and Dad, when is our little new sister coming home? Well, the doctors haven't released her yet. We can go visit her again. And, she was normal, born that term. What are we doing?
Oh, I mean, my son is 19 years old, and I can remember every detail of his birth. And, he came out, they weighed him. I think he came out, went right on my wife's chest. They weighed him, and the next day home we went.
That's great.
The idea of that not being the process in the absence of some sort of real illness or something, I can't even imagine that was standard practice. Seems barbaric.
It was medical dogma. And with pendulum swings, it's the over-medicalization of ordinary life, and then it swings to a response that is revolting against that, which says no medical intervention whatsoever. I'm just going to deliver at home with nobody else. And I don't think that's safe either. You get into trouble during the delivery. So there's a balance, and that's where we need to be. And you saw that same thing with the trust issue in COVID, right? All these people now, I'm never going to trust doctors anymore.
Well, the microbiome story, and the thing that strikes me as interesting and difficult there is that you're listing all of these different, seemingly unrelated health outcomes that are correlating with these two patient groups. uh, and their impact of early use of antibiotics. And I can only speak from a first principles basis. I don't have any medical training, but the complexity of not just the body, which is like a universe in its own. We're each like walking around with a universe of complexity,
Yes.
like all the stars in the sky. And then the millions of interactions that are happening in food and environment and sleep and all these different things.
Mm-hmm.
So it is hard to take any one this leads to that claim all that seriously, especially when it sounds like a silver bullet. Like my skepticism rises when I hear something that sounds a little too much like the answer everyone's been looking for. Oh, it's the microbiome, or it's clean food, or is that a good heuristic to be worried about this like silver bullet mentality? Is that another impulse out there when it comes to health and nutrition? How do you think about that? How do you talk to patients and people in the policy space about beware the silver bullet?
Well, I think it's a good point because we've been burned before, having been told there's a unifying theory of health, and if we fix this one thing, we'll magically all have a healthier population. I think in science, our job is to ask questions, and that's what I think it's good for people out there to ask. It's why I wrote the book Blind Spots, to share the latest scientific research on these things that suggest a correlation. Now, even though we're seeing all these incredible correlations with the microbiome and health, we're still not sure how to remedy the problem of an altered microbiome. There's millions of probiotics and they're very popular, and it's usually based on the marketing of the company, how good the marketing is.
You're talking about like great yogurts and supplements and all this kind of
all
stuff.
That stuff.
Enzymes, stomach enzymes.
All the enzymes and the bacteria, they get sort of bacterial therapy. Which ones are going right through your system and which ones may actually stick in the microbiome and help with that balance. And so
and I've heard that that's one of the challenges in this space, because there's a lot, you go on YouTube and type microbiome like I did last night, and you find all kinds of people that are super pumped about the microbiome. But then you also find other things saying, actually, we sort of revert to the mean. So you take augmentin because you got a cut, and 6 months later, your stomach is more or less back to what it was like, as best we can tell, to the extent we have things that can measure this effectively, which who knows?
Yes. I think the important take-home messages are: avoid unnecessary antibiotics. There's a dogma that they're probably not going to help you. It looks like it's viral, but they won't hurt you, so just take it anyway. No, they can hurt you. Avoid unnecessary C-sections. Now, I can't possibly give instructions to folks out there about when to take an antibiotic or do a C-section and when not to. That's a discussion with the doctor. But everybody knows that there's a consumerist demand around these things.
Well, C-section is also interesting because, as I understand it, there's not just a medical dogma from a health perspective part of that, but there's a malpractice incentive to do C-sections. So have you looked at that as part of your work at Hopkins? Because as I understand it, if you're an OBGYN, like my grandmother delivered babies, thousands of babies in Philly, Mary Longo, Mary Popola. You might get sued 18 years from now because a baby you delivered is only getting B's in class, and the parents are uppity, and they think something's wrong, and someone tells them maybe during delivery they were too delayed and didn't move quick enough. And that things like that's the most extreme version of it being overwrought. There obviously are times when there really is like a bad decision made by a doctor during delivery, but it seems like the fear around the impacts of vaginal birth and delivery and delays and oxygen has given rise to just cut the baby out.
Yeah.
Let's schedule it and we'll cut the baby out, and then nobody can come back and sue me as an OBGYN for future concerns about all the things that can come about from the complications from vaginal birth. Is that a big part of what's happened in our in birth in America?
I mean, the OBs are getting slammed with the frivolous malpractice lawsuits, and that's another topic. But I think it's a smaller driver of the over C-section problem for a couple of reasons.
Interesting.
One is it goes both ways. People get sued during C-section because they were, the parent says you did it a certain way, you should have done it another way. You talk to the OB doctors and the nurses. What I've learned is it is a brutal job. It's a very hard job. I think OB and labor and delivery is the hardest job in all of medicine. I mean, you're dealing with constant emergencies, essentially, where the bar is very, very high. If anything goes wrong, I mean, that is, in our field, we're dealing with people who are at the end of life. When you're dealing with a child, right? When things go great, nobody says, oh, there's an amazing outcome. They're doing great outcomes at the local hospital. When one child dies, the whole community knows about it, and it is a tragedy. So I think what's driving a lot of it is not the malpractice. It's the fact it's a very difficult job. And studies have found that nurses even have C-section rates, even though they take random shifts. They can sort of steer things towards the C-section or not. Taking cat naps all night waiting for someone to deliver in labor is brutal on a doctor's health, and it's miserable. I've done it as a resident and as a student. And what I found is that there's sort of this incentive. I got a full day in the operating room tomorrow. I don't want to be cat napping all night. So a doctor can go in there and sort of misrepresent things a little bit by dangling the phrase, well, a C-section might be safer for the baby. And if you say that to a pregnant woman in labor anywhere in the world, 100% as part of the maternal instinct will say, well, then let's do it. And so I think we have these little nudges in medicine. We have them in every field. You got bone on bone, so we got to do a knee replacement. Well, bone is normally on bone, right? It's the question is how much soft tissue is there.
All of us have heard this bone on bone.
Yeah, you got bone on bone. We got to then do a knee replacement. We have our nudges in every field. You could die. I mean, right now people are asking good questions about childhood vaccines. Most of the medical establishment has no answers. Doesn't mean they're not justified. Doesn't mean there's not good science supported. But out of all the vaccines, some are supported by better evidence than others. People are asking questions. We don't have the answers for them. So generally we throw out there, well, you could die, Okay, well, people want better answers than that. And there is that kind of nudge sometimes that is borders on manipulation. And so that drives some of it. I think that drives some of it. But, there's also consumerist demand. There's clinics now where the mom walks out after the first prenatal visit and the receptionist is saying, when would you like to schedule your C-section? Well, it wasn't discussed. And where's the informed consent and all? Oh, no, we just want to offer you a date in case you want it. Like, if that's how we're practicing medicine today, that's pretty bad, because there is a dogma that there's no difference for your health or your baby's health if a baby is born by C-section or through vaginal birth. Now, again, C-sections save lives, but it needs to be judiciously applied in the right setting and the right person.
I want to move on to the incentive structures that you're alluding to. But before I do, is there any other blind spots you'd like to call out? The book is filled with them about childbirth, cancer, GLP-1s. But is there anything that stands out to you, beyond what we've already talked about, as like a blind spot that I, as a dad, as a husband, as an adult, should be paying close attention to?
I think allergies is one of the hottest topics where there's been a massive reversal by the medical establishment, but it's not been really put out there publicly. So there was a recommendation in the year 2000, so what's that, 24 years ago, when the medical establishment wanted to give parents an answer when they were asking, how do I prevent a peanut allergy in my kid? So the medical establishment, the American Academy of Pediatrics, in their hubris, in a small committee within their leadership, decided, well, they didn't know. They should have just said that. And I asked them, why didn't you say that? Well, we had to tell them to do something. That's what they said.
We have to do something. This is something. Let's do this. In fact, you have to do this.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
So the British comedy version of medicine.
Yeah. So they got it perfectly backwards. They didn't know. They put something out there. It was not only incorrect, they said that what I'm referring to is the recommendation for all pregnant mothers and lactating mothers and children 0 through 3 to avoid 100% of any peanut product, peanut butter, anything. And that recommendation of total peanut abstinence sensitized the immune system. They forgot about a basic principle in medicine called immune tolerance, or what parents had described as the dirt theory. They're around dirt,
Right.
germs, and cats and dogs, they're not going to be allergic.
In psychology, it's exposure therapy.
Exposure therapy.
Yeah.
Same thing. So they created a generation of children that have been tortured with severe peanut allergies because of the extreme abstinence. The peanut allergy is where, and I go through it all in the book, where a rare thing and usually mild. In Africa and most parts of the world, there's no such thing as peanut allergies. They have peanut in their soup and it's part of the culture, and peanut butter. Now, you don't want to give whole peanuts to young children. That's a choking risk, obviously.
Yeah.
But peanut butter should be introduced in infancy, as soon as a kid can eat. The experts, the true experts who objected to the recommendation when it took on a life of its own, and the whole world,
well, not just at home, but we all know the schools and no, you're not allowed to bring peanut butter and it's like, so me, the Gen Xer, is like, wait, I can't make my son a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I got to use this almond butter. This isn't as good. It's like, yeah, like it took off through everywhere. Every institution that came close to kids, peanuts became verboten.
And here's the reason why kids now have real and severe peanut allergies just from being near a peanut, which we hadn't really seen before in human history. Still unheard of in Africa, where they didn't adopt our American Academy of Pediatrics abstinence recommendation. It's the severe type of allergy took off. And so when kids were avoided peanuts early in life, the rate of peanut allergies, including the ultra severe allergy type you're talking about, where schools now have to ban it.
EpiPen level.
EpiPen in every classroom. I mean, it's unbelievable. The industry that we've created in the United States doesn't exist in Africa. Again, does not exist. And why is that? The peanut avoidance didn't prevent peanut allergies. It caused them. They got it perfectly backwards. When a kid is later in life, they've done the follow-up studies now. One was just published this year in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing the rate of peanut of allergies later is much higher, more than 8-fold higher, including severe type. And so the recommendation from these experts who I interviewed in the book Blind Spots was introduce a little bit of peanut butter, milk, eggs. One pediatrician tries to encourage infants to be around some cats and dogs early in life. The immune system is training and it's learning what's foreign and what's your own. And so it breeds immune tolerance when there's early exposure. And that's the way to go now. But people are still living in the past. This was just reversed. Like I said, the New England Journal article just came out this year. Another one was in 2015, 9 years ago. Where was the humility to publicly and vigorously admit they made a terrible recommendation, set the record straight, and put the correction out as vigorously as the original recommendation? And so this is the Bermuda Triangle of public health and healthcare right now, is that we have these massive blind spots that we have to correct, we have to reconcile, we have to show humility, and we have to educate the public what the best practices are. So when you ask me, is there one thing, I feel like this idea of early exposure and when and how and the studies are something I go through in the book Blind Spots that I think people should know.
There is something so simple about this. And I've been aware of the peanut allergy problem for a bunch of different reasons, some of which come back to why this show even exists, which is uh, it does have mirrors in our psychology and our behavior and the way we raise our kids, that we have created various kinds of like bubble boy problems.
Yeah.
So social media creates a social bubble in which you don't get to experience the fullness of human relationships, including rejection and butterflies in your stomach because you want to ask a girl out on a date or ask a boy, or like, no, now it's all going to be through texts. So it's all sterilized. Everything's sterilized. And that COVID did the same thing. Oh no, we're going to mask up. We're going to wash our groceries. We're going to do this hyper sterilization. Everywhere you go now, there's going to be antibiotic, uh, you know, creams and lotions. And so we're constantly covering ourselves in super bug creators all the time. Um, but it does seem like a kind of fundamental mechanism of the human, our immune system, our psychology, that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. We need to be exposed to a non toxic dose of just about everything: peanuts, heartbreak, loss, pain, broken bones, bee stings, you know, chicken pox. Like, a little of exposure goes a long way. Is that a pretty good heuristic for just like, how am I healthy? How am I raise healthy kids? Like, give them a little bit of everything.
Well, I think it's consistent with the concept of immune tolerance. And then on a population level with children, we are doing tremendous damage to children by putting them in these bubbles, sterilizing their lives, and then assigning diagnoses to them like it's candy. If a kid is nervous before an exam, why are we telling the kid, you have anxiety? We're giving them a chronic disease and often medicating them. We're converting America's children into a generation of patients. And what's happening is that in some cases, we're engaging in the medicalization of ordinary life. If kids need to feel different emotions, it can be normal. And the boundaries of what's normal and not normal, which need to be there, are now completely obscured. And it's a consumerist demand. Every kid is, somewhere in the diagnosis world of having a condition. And what are we doing about these things? We're putting the kids on more meds and more meds. Pretty soon, every 6-year-old in America is going to be on 4 different medications. And every kid that likes potato chips is going to be on Ozempic. What are we doing? We are doing a tremendous disservice to children that need to feel different emotions within the context of a loving relationship, a community. And instead, we tell kids, suicide, for example. The CDC does the absolute worst thing for suicide that you can do to a kid. They have these posters that go in the schools that basically say, this happens and is very common, suggesting you might want to do this or you might be one of these kids. This is how it's done. And there's almost nothing you can do about it. So maybe call this number. And it's like, you're doing everything in the world of suicide science. You're doing everything you're not supposed to be doing. And then we take these kids who normally are going through the confusion of childhood with who they are, identity, gender, and we're assigning these diagnoses and doing life-altering operations and sterilization procedures. It's the medicalization of ordinary life in many cases. And it's a nuanced topic, but this is a trend in medicine where nobody is talking about communities to treat depression. Instead, it's drugs to treat depression. No one's talking about talk therapy. Instead, it's drugs. No one's talking about changing the schools so that a kid doesn't have to sit at a desk obediently for 8 hours. Maybe that's not normal for every kid. Maybe in an ancient society, a kid who was curious and active and would talk a lot would be a great warrior or scholar. But in today's modern world, just because they can't sit in a chair for 8 hours, we tell them,
Yeah. This is my favorite subject, actually. Yeah, we tell them, if you don't sit down and shut up in the most boring possible constricture, you're a bad person and a bad citizen.
Are you familiar with the 6 major types of intelligence that were delineated by this Harvard professor. One of them is spatial. So, in the old days, it was verbal and math, and
Yeah.
I mean, such a broken way of assessing the intelligence of kids. Now we're recognizing there's many domains of intelligence, including musical, including coordination, why these super athletes, that is a form of intelligence, awareness, self-awareness, and perceptive awareness, people who are good in mathematics and logic, and then what we call the high spatial intelligence. Their mind is racing with questions. I actually have this. I was diagnosed late in life. I don't know if diagnosed is the right term. It's not a disease. It's my personality type. My brain is constantly racing with questions, ideas, wondering about this, connects to this, what would this person. And so I have trouble sometimes focusing, but it also enables someone to think creatively. And when the developmental optometrist who talked with me about this, it wasn't a problem, but I was in there with my a family member who got this diagnosis, and I said, "You're talking to the choir. I got the same thing as my whole life." And they said these folks tend to be entrepreneurs. Elon Musk is like this. I mean, they don't do well.
Clearly. He's clearly like going 1,000 miles an hour.
You can see it in his eyes, like when he's talking. So what do we do with these kids? We tell them, sit still, take these medications to sit still. And if you don't sit still, you're not going to learn. Maybe they need to learn another way. And so this family member, the doc said, she shouldn't change. The school should change because she has this incredible intelligence that the schools don't understand. It's called spatial intelligence, high spatial. So sure enough, we switched schools and she's thriving.
I have one more specific medical question before we talk about the system, and that this comes by way of my wife. Hypothetically, is there a relationship between the microbiome? It's Dad Saves America, remember? And gas. Is there you're a stomach doc?
Yeah.
Help me with the farting, doc. Don't shoot the messenger. For those of us who are dads, that we take a certain amount of glee in clearing the room. Is it because of the augmentin? What's the deal?
I don't think I've ever been asked that before in my entire career of
I bet I'm turning
gastrointestinal. No, but I think there is something there, right? Because we know the methane gas and the flatulence is a product of bacteria in the microbiome. It's produced by the bacteria in the microbiome. When we change the composition of the microbiome, it's very plausible that is contributing. Now, I will tell you something else. A lot of people talk to their doctor about private issues, and one of those issues is gas. And as a gastrointestinal surgeon, I've had a lot of people ask me, and it turns out that like 90% of people, in my experience, perceive that they produce more gas, they fart more than the average person. So people are unaware of what the baseline is, but it's actually normal, and it's actually often, when they think it's abnormal, it's often within the normal boundaries.
But it's not within the boundaries that our wives want.
Yeah, it's that's a much broader conversation of expectation and disappointment.
Yes. Okay, so speaking of disappointment, the medical system is a disappointment. And it seems like there's a bunch of different threads going on here. So one is we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about this sort of oligarch of dogma lab coat experts pushing things that turn out to be false, maybe even often at the time when it's being pushed. There's this broader set of incentives that are in place and that have been tweaked and changed over time. Mostly it seems like for worse. But how do you understand what's wrong with American medicine as an industry, let's say? Because we like to say system, like your operating system on your computer, but it's really not a system. It's a set of institutions and the government and hospitals. It's an industry. So what's wrong with the industry here?
I think the business was never designed to put patients at the center. It was sort of haphazard, put together de facto. It started altruistically. If you look at America's hospitals, the first hospital in the United States from your hometown of Philadelphia, was Pennsylvania Hospital at like, I think it was Ninth and Spruce. An amazing place, an amazing place. Co-founded by Benjamin Franklin, this guy Benjamin Rush, who was a psychiatrist. It was funded by philanthropy. Had a charter to be a safe haven for people, regardless of their race or their beliefs or their ability to pay. I mean, that is our great medical heritage. And what happened over time is we didn't know how to manage the cost of certain technologies. So we created this concept of insurance. It started from a hospital in Texas.
Yeah, Baylor, right?
Baylor, yeah. They started the first insurance, and it kind of, clunked along. And then what happened is the healthcare system had this explosion of scientific information, everything from cardiac stents to complex surgery. These bills were kind of funny money where the insurance companies, the hospitals are paying themselves. And then these consultants swooped in the 1980s and they said, hey, hospitals, here's a game you can play and we'll show you exactly how to do it. Dial up your prices to some massive astronomical price that nobody will pay. And then the discounts that you offer will be off that high sticker price and you'll get more money from insurance. Well, insurance over time managed this by raising deductibles, raised premiums, and they kind of, realized, well, we got to consolidate to be able to put the squeeze on the hospitals more and have more power in negotiating these discounts. And the hospitals said the same thing, and we started this arms race. And everyone that goes into medicine at every level is a good person. I mean,
I would say most people in general are good people and want to just live a good life, create value for others. And then they get into the complexity of their industry and they're trying to figure it out and all this stuff.
Yeah, the perverse incentives.
But continue.
I mean, the sort of girl in junior high school that when asked, what do you want to go into? And they say, I'm thinking about becoming a nurse. They're different from their peers. There's this calling in medicine, and it's at every level, administration. And so we have a community of people united around a sense of compassion. It's an incredible heritage that we uphold. But we've inherited this broken system. And instead of redesigning it or challenging it or speaking out, people get frustrated. They put their head down and they just end up collecting their paycheck every 2 weeks. And the people at the top, the doctors and the medical elite establishment, are kind of busy in this academic hierarchy and, climbing that academic ladder. Well, I got to the point where I went as far as you can go in kind of record time. I had the privilege of a lot of research going really well, great mentors, got an opportunity to work with the head surgeon at Johns Hopkins, then joined his group, and he kind of helped carry my career. And then you realize at a certain point, most of the research we do, most people aren't reading the studies. They're not making a big impact. Most of the conferences I'm going to are dumb. They're just talking to ourselves, talking ideas that never leave the echo chambers of the inside of medicine. And what are we doing? What are we doing? We have the most medicated generation in the history of the world. We're witnessing the medicalization of ordinary life. We're seeing patients get price gouged to the point where they don't trust us anymore. These bills are illegible. We're disconnected. The public doesn't trust us. What are we doing? We have these silos in medicine from our fragmented specialization system where we glorify people who are highly specialized, but we're missing out on the fact that certain things are connected to health broadly, and they can cover 80 different specialties, and no one is really looking at the whole picture sometimes. Menopause, general body inflammation, food as medicine, the microbiome, metabolic health, mitochondrial health. These are the core topics in medicine. I mean, metabolic health is at the core of insulin resistance, obesity, diabetes. We're not talking about these topics. Instead, we have this reactionary system that is a system for sickness. We treat sickness.
It does seem like everything you just listed, you could say is like the programming schedule for like self-directed health YouTubers. It's like these, and chiropractics and naturopaths and DOs. There's this uh the blind spots that you're talking about are getting filled by um a broad brush alternative medical
Hmm.
industry.
Yes.
And yet we still have, I think it's almost 20% of GDP is being spent inside the formal medical system. Especially a lot of, at least half of that, maybe now it's more than 60%, is Medicare, Medicaid, um, Obamacare, all of that. Um, and I've seen some instances, some research suggesting that at least half of every dollar spent is just totally wasted. It has no positive impact on health and wellness. Um, so that is a pretty inefficient, bleak looking picture for a system. Um,
So
what?
there's a solution. There's a solution. So people are hungry to address these blind spots in medicine. And that's where you're seeing the rise of what you're describing, the holistic and alternative and naturopathic and all of this entire response to try to fill the gaps. Now they don't have the funding from the NIH to support a lot of the stuff, and um, they struggle with getting good dollars to support some of that badly needed research. But um, you're seeing now a group of doctors saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this system. I'm rejecting it. I'm throwing it out the window. I'm going to do 1 or 2 hour visits with people. I'm going to do it on a subscription basis. If it's not concierge and subscription based care, they're going to have employers pay for it. So it's free to individual American workers, or they're just going to take on some charity work as a part of their practice. And they are redesigning the entire delivery of care. They are learning from doctors who are applying good scientific rigor to what we call functional medicine. This guy, Mark Hyman, is one of the leaders nationally in it. There's a bunch of docs. Peter Attia in Austin is one of those doctors now educating doctors on these broad unifying basis for health concepts. We're doing research that is showing us over and over again that we've been doing too much. 15 years of putting stents in liberally in people's hearts with no survival benefit outside of an acute coronary syndrome.
I understand angioplasty is another one of these procedures that's turned out to be kind of a waste.
We're learning all of these interventions that we've been doing. If there's one theme in the medical literature, my research, and we're constantly reading the studies that come out, and we're filtering them, sharing them, discussing them. And if there's one theme in the last 10 years in the medical literature, if you had to read all 40,000 articles that come out each year and identify one common thread, it's that indications that we thought were broad are more narrow than we recognized, that we shouldn't be operating as frequently as we did. We shouldn't be medicating as frequently as we should have. We shouldn't be diagnosing sometimes. And so these learnings are coming out of the fact that the science doesn't change. It's a fact. You can have all your opinions in the world, but ultimately a good study will expose a modern day practice. And so we're learning more and more that we don't need to add this chemotherapy. There's a study that showed that their patients with rectal cancer don't need chemo or radiation or surgery, and they can be cured with a simple pill that's called a PD-1 blocker. And so we're learning now this common theme that maybe with good intentions we were doing too much. So we're seeing the addressing of overtreatment. We're seeing this new rise of doctors that want to look holistically. I don't want to call it holistic medicine, but it includes that. I don't want to call it alternative, but it includes that. It's the redesign of healthcare altogether. And they're working with employers now who don't need to be convinced like Medicare to pay for something. They're just going to say, hey, you have a great program to help with the workers in my company that have diabetes. I'm going to make that a benefit for them. The hard part of treating chronic disease is not telling people what to do. It's helping them do it, helping them understand what foods are right, how to check their sugars, what to do differently, and it's giving them the right information. Turns out that probably one of the best tests that anybody could get is called an ApoB, ApoB and lipoprotein little a. Anyone who's going to have some blood work done, make sure it's added if you've never had this done before.
What's that all about?
These are the lipoproteins that indicate in a much more sensitive way than HDL and LDL that suggest who is at risk of early heart disease. And it can help, if somebody knows how to interpret the results, help identify those who may need more aggressive therapy or treatment or studies to prevent heart disease than others. In the past, we used these very crude markers, and then people just, have a heart attack. All their tests were normal. We don't know what happened. Now we're finding out people who have heart disease in their 40s have a heart attack when they're 50. We go back and it turns out their LP little a sometimes was high, and it could have been tested before. These are tests that should be the focus of a massive public health effort. So these doctors who are thinking holistically, they're not cardiologists, but they're interested in cardiology. They're not nephrologists, but they understand, and they're intellectually curious. They're delivering holistic care. There's direct primary care that many employers are buying. And many of the ripoffs in the healthcare system can be averted by employers making better decisions on their health insurance and health benefits. I'm not talking about a low or high deductible plan. Swap out your pharmacy benefit manager altogether. That is a pay-as-you-go insurance that every company in America has a pharmacy benefit manager, like they have health insurance for their employees. Now they're kind of sold separately, and you can swap out the rip-off PBMs using a good consultant and sign up for one of the many that are transparent, honest, and are not going to rip off. Most of businesses in America are getting ripped off by about 20 to 25% on their health benefits they pay for their employees. I'm not talking about unnecessary medical procedures. I'm talking about the middleman waste in the system and the spread pricing and the money games and rebates and kickbacks. Employers who are informed, and I've seen this and I've helped some, can actually say, I don't want to get ripped off anymore. I don't want an insurance company that's going to rip me off. I don't want all this middleman waste. I don't want a pharmacy benefit plan that's going to mark up the drugs. I want honest, fair, transparent. You've seen what Mark Cuban is doing. We think on our research team that half of all government spending at the federal level goes to healthcare. Now, it's been understood it's a fifth of GDP, but when you look at government spending, Medicare plus Medicaid, Social Security is like a quarter of it. Half of Social Security checks are going to healthcare expenses for seniors, copays, deductibles, non-covered services, coinsurance. The military has its own healthcare system. It's like 15% of their budget. They got doctors and hospitals.
Right. The VA is coming out of that. So.
And the VA is even separate. That's like over 5% next year's budget. Then we pay for health benefits for 9 million federal workers and beneficiaries. It's like 50% of federal spending goes to healthcare in its many hidden forms outside of Medicare. So these are problems we can fix. And this is the work of our research team working in public policy.
So you want to talk about Dogma? I'm going to put my free market Dogma hat on. And that is, as I understand it, in 1950-ish, and my grandfather practiced medicine for a long time. In fact, when I was little, we were in the second floor of a house that he had his doctor's office in the front. It appears, looking at least some of the data, and I haven't done an exhaustive academic level look, but when you look at like doctor bills in the 50s before the passage of Medicare, Medicaid, whether it's the cost of delivery for a healthy birth, or general doctor's visits, the cash you'd pay out of pocket in real terms, adjusted for inflation, it was just cheaper, period, then than now, out of pocket. So what I mean there, and I'd love for you to correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding though is, okay, you went to the doctor, you're gonna have a baby, you kind of know when that's going to be roughly. Actually, not that rough, right? So you could save $100 a month, and you could give birth to the baby and pay cash. In fact, you had to pay cash because you can't insure something you know that's going to happen in 8 months. And so you paid cash. Today, you'll pay the same amount of cash out of your pocket and then insurance and or Obamacare or Medicare will come in and quintuple that. The same is true of you could visit my grandfather, pay cash. Today it's a copay and then the bill on top. So it seems like all this third party payer, insurance, government, Medicare, all it did was blow a lot of hot air into the system, inflate prices. It all got captured in, just like with Pell Grants, and you could go to Berkeley for $1,500 at the same time, and now it's 70 grand. Like all the government seems to have done is come in and inflate the living hell out of all the prices in real terms. Is that rough? Is that the way you understand what's happened?
I think that when you don't have transparency of prices, the way markets move is they move towards price gouging. And then when you add a third-party payer, oh, we're price gouging the third-party payer, we're not price gouging the individual consumer. And it becomes this money grab. And that's what we have in healthcare. And so the fundamental problem in healthcare is that we have non-transparent markets. People are shopping for care not on prices and quality, but on billboards and NFL ads and valet parking. We need competition in healthcare, but we need it at the level of price and quality. And they have been elusive things to measure in healthcare. And so we have done a couple things. One, my prior book, The Price We Pay, called for hospitals to post common prices, their prices for common shoppable services. And so it was read by policymakers, and there was a bipartisan executive order that was upheld in 2 administrations of different parties and upheld by the courts, where now hospitals are required to post prices for common shoppable services. Now you're going to have some price competition. The secret discounts insurance companies have with hospitals, why are they secret? The second part of that order requires public disclosure. And now we're in the process of scraping all that data to make it presentable to individuals. We hope that converts non-competitive markets into competitive markets. When you go to buy a ticket for an airline,
Pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. And different things can happen on the flight. It can be canceled, staffing costs, fuel costs can change. The plane could crash and cost them millions of dollars. They don't charge you if the plane crashes the millions of dollars. So they build in the heterogeneity of the risk of pricing into the model to come up with a fixed price, just like we should be doing for childbirth. We don't know if it's going to be a C-section or natural delivery. We don't know if you're going to go to the ICU. We can build that into the model and publish a fixed price that is a fair price, that is a price that hospitals can compete on. Imagine you went on an airline and they said, oh, we're just going to bill you after the flight. We can't give you a price. Just get on the plane. Yeah. We'll see what kind of insurance you have. And then you start getting a flurry of surprise bills. And, this one's for a Coke you consumed. You'd say that is a dysfunctional market that has enabled price gouging. And that's exactly what we have in healthcare.
I had this exact experience, and I did everything I could because I had this happen before. So 2 summers ago, I had COVID. It was going fine. I'm still alive. But I did start, my throat started to hurt like crazy. Like I couldn't swallow it. And so it was really a problem. So I went to a otolaryngologist, ENT, here in town. She scoped me. She saw a bunch of sores, look like kind of, almost like tonsillitis, canker sore looking white stuff right above my voice box. She was like, yep, we've seen this happen. There's really not anything we can do about it. It's just going to go away. It's not obstructed. You're not at risk of asphyxiation or anything like that.
Don't need antibiotics.
No, didn't give me antibiotics. But she said, look, you're probably dehydrated. I'll write you a script to go across the street to the hospital, and they can just basically give you a topical gargle, a little bit of painkiller, and put you on an IV to rehydrate you. And I asked,
$3,000.
I said, Doc, this is not an ER visit, right? You're writing me a script to go to get a service.
Yeah.
You're talking about a bag of water and a gargle.
Yeah.
No. It'll be fine. We have a partnership with the hospital. We'll just go walk over. I walk in. I'm like, this is the ER entrance. I talk to the woman in front. I got the script. I'm not in an emergency here. I can just wait. Like, I don't want to get killed for nothing. No, it's fine. But she didn't know anything. I sit there for a couple minutes. There's nobody there. I get brought to the back. I sit in a room that feels, like the barren, horrible stuff that hospitals feel like. I get seen by a couple people for like 20 minutes. I get a gargle. I get an IV. All right, great. I walk out. I get a bill for $900, which I'm like, well, that's too much money for 30 minutes and a bag of water. But it's better than typical for a ER, so I'm thinking I'm probably fine. I get an additional bill 4 months later for $5,000, which I simply don't pay. I don't pay it. I'm not paying this. It goes back and forth. I just waited a year. They eventually cut it in half, which is still insane for a bag of water for 30 minutes.
Half.
I was like, I've been through this already. I don't know what else I could have done as a patient from a medical family.
Yes.
At every step along the way, I asked, how much is this going to cost? It's a bag of water.
Yeah.
Still got screwed. And the thing is, I called the doctor's office. Well, that's not really us. She wrote the script, but it's the hospital. Take it up at the hospital. The hospital is a non-profit Catholic hospital.
Yeah, the consultants got to all these folks to jack up the bills and play the game. So there's a practice where hospitals will have you sign a form that it's called consent, but really it should be two forms. It should be a financial consent and a treatment consent, but they merge it in a predatory way, unfairly, into one document. And they just say, you have to sign it. Some receptionist, you have to sign it. Well, the form says that you sign your life, home, mortgage, retirement, savings away with no price under penalty of law. And you swear to, testify that this is, well, you don't have to sign this. This is against the law to force somebody to sign it because there's a law that says, called EMTALA, hospitals are required to take care of anyone in an emergency room with an urgent or emergent condition. You don't have to sign any financial document. You don't have to give your credit card. Everybody needs to know that. A little bit of consumer tip out there. And then we expose this practice where hospitals not just engage in price gouging, but they then sue people who don't pay the bill in full. And oftentimes it's low-income folks. And they sue them to garnish their wages. This was present in a third of the hospitals we studied. We exposed this in the Journal of the American Medical Association in a big study and a series of follow-up studies. And my students and I went to the courthouses and saw hundreds of names of people in a little town that were being sued in the docket that day for not paying their bills, to have their wages from Walmart and other small employers garnish their wages. These are Walmart, food service workers. Walmart was number one in this sample. Food service workers, number two. Postal service, I think, was number three. Hospital workers, like our own, like custodians. Like, what the hell are we doing? And so we started advocating in front of the judge. We would tell people, hey, we're a bunch of students and doctors from the local hospital, and we're happy to speak to the judge on your behalf, because they don't know what's going on. They're scared. They got this summons.
Right.
And we would argue on their behalf, Your Honor, they don't owe the money. There's no legal contract that they signed. And if there is, it was signed under duress in a criminal case. That would be considered entrapment. They came to us as a profession in need, hurting, looking for help. And this is what the hospital billing and administration is doing to people. This is financial toxicity. It's predatory and it's unethical. If it doesn't violate the letter of the law, it's certainly the spirit of the law. And we started getting people off over and over again. We would do this. Our students would do it. I started doing it. My students said, well, we want to come with you next time. I said, you can't really, because this is the border of kind of, I'm a professor, but this is an off-campus activity. There's no approvals. You can't come. Well, they said, we're going anyway. And they showed up. And we got so many people off on the basis of no valid legal contract under contract law. And so when you're pestered by these collections agencies, or they take it to court, which they do quietly sometimes, most people never show up to court because they don't know what's happening. People need to understand that this is a civil society. And in a civil society, we have a rule of law, and that means we need to have civil contracts with transparent terms, not predatory terms.
It is bizarre because it's unlike all the other complex services that we purchase. And I know there's all kinds of arguments about how, and Kenneth Arrow and others have studied, have made sort of economic arguments of like healthcare is kind of different and it's more asymmetric information. You don't know what you're buying because the doctor's the expert and you're just a rube. It's like, yeah, I don't know how anything works. I don't know how this works.
Well, I mean,
I can't build one of these. But you know what? The price keeps going down. I keep getting more for less. It's a highly complex product. Okay, given I might get cancer, and that could be a monumentally complex problem that involves a lot of people's time. But there's nowhere else in the economy is the cost relationship so fundamentally irrational. And I don't think doctors and hospitals are greedier on average.
Mm-mm.
It seems like it's just a cartel. Like I understand that in many communities, maybe most of the country, there's something called a certificate of need.
Yeah.
Are you familiar? I imagine you're
yeah.
familiar with this. So for those who aren't familiar, what is the certificate of need?
Well, it's a permission slip that the state government issues to a hospital or medical group in order to build or set up a clinic or medical facility. And so it's really government regulation of who can expand or grow or who can set up a shop and who can't. Not every state has them. I think like 13 states or something have them. And it is very political. The big dog monopoly hospital that's price gouging everybody in their town doesn't want competition. So when the new hospital sets up an application for one, there's often a big battle, and it's this game. Again, the fundamental problem in healthcare is we have non-transparent markets. And you're so right. I mean, is it more complex than a jumbo jet flying? I mean, a pilot doesn't sit in...
Or a car. It's like there's so many cars.
They're not billing you for the steering wheel.
I don't know how to build a car.
Yeah.
I don't know how to fix... I can kind of fix a little bit, but not really.
Yeah.
Like the transmission drops in my car. I don't know what I'm doing. I got to take it to somebody who knows things I don't know. And I can price shop down the street, and that all seems to work just fine.
Yeah. I think we'll eventually we're pushing the field to try to get to a point where we have honest, fair prices for presentations of services. We don't need to bill people for the spark plug and the wheel and the steering wheel and the transmission all separately in a flurry of bills. This market can be cleaned up, and I think we're starting to see it. There are hospitals that would blow you away, how they have a fixed price menu. There's emergency rooms now, fixed price menus. There are pharmacies now that are disrupting that middleman pharmacy chain. So these are things that we're very interested in, done a lot of work on. And I'm actually optimistic about the future of healthcare.
We're sitting here in Texas. There's a Oklahoma surgery center that does this.
Yes.
It doesn't take insurance. I've heard the docs that own it and operate it talk about it at length. Yeah, I imagine you're familiar with these guys.
I love those guys. They will not fill out the standard claims forms with all the codes. They're like, hey, you had a hysterectomy, you had tonsillectomy, here's the bill. Tonsillectomy, whatever the dollar is, knee replacement, $12,000. There's not like 50,000 codes and upcoding and playing present on admission and the whole coding world. And the insurance companies are like, oh, we don't accept this. We need you to fill out our long claims form. And they're like, no, this is the price. You come to meet us. So
the there's a NPR did a story. This was part of they had this team called Planet Money that was pretty awesome and actually very like kind of pro like very market oriented. Adam Davidson and the team. They did this story, How to Pay a Doctor, I think was the title, something like that. And it basically highlighted how with the advent of Medicare and Medicaid, that truly was the beginning of the end of price transparency, because now it's taken from taxes, and now a bunch of dueling bureaucracies are trying to decide what everything should cost. And it's like the podcast to my ear was like, well, this is just a story of why government sucks. It was just one stupid maneuver after another. And this list of codes you're talking about was born out of this. Like these, oh, well, let me say that you have osteoporosis because that will fit to the code that lets me give you the medicine I want, and it'll get covered because it fits into this code. It's like this bureaucratic list. Is there a chance that that can go away?
Medicare and Medicaid?
One could hope. But the codes thing, like that, why not pay for the outcome?
Guess who makes money on the code book? Guess who has the IP ownership and who you have to pay a small licensing fee to every time you use a code? The American Medical Association, a group that has maybe 2 or 3% of practicing attending physicians who are members, but makes gobs of money, millions from this book and their licensing fees. It's almost like we've painted ourselves into a corner. And so I still have a tremendous amount of faith in America's rank and file doctors, community doctors, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, respiratory therapists, techs, hospital administrators. They're doing an incredible job on a local level. And this giant system has been imposed on them that they didn't design, but they have to deal with these nightmares all the time. So the reason we haven't had prices is not because anyone wants to keep the public in the dark. It's that we've been focused on taking care of patients, and we've just blocked out. The medical culture has blocked all this out. In medical school, you get zero education in the business of medicine, coding, billing of the healthcare system. You get almost zero education in nutrition. Probably be better if it were zero, because the little you get is misinformation from the government food pyramid. And so you come out not just unaware of how the healthcare system works or unaware of how nutrition works, but unaware and perceiving that you're the expert, which is the worst combination.
Yeah. It's not what we know that's the problem. It's what we what we know that just ain't so.
Right.
Isn't that right? It's something like that.
Right.
As we come to a close, what is the biggest single margin of opportunity to make a really substantial difference in our health care system?
Everyone's getting rich in healthcare for the most part, except for one stakeholder group that has no lobby, and that is the American worker. They are funding this broken system through their paycheck deduction, both from the insurance premium and from the Medicare excise tax.
Yep.
You can look at any paycheck. And so there are things people should do, I think, in terms of both their health and the healthcare system. In terms of the healthcare system in general, do some research on pricing. There's a number of websites now that give you fixed prices. You can call, ask for price. It's kind of like organic food at restaurants. The more people ask, the more the restaurants want to meet that demand.
Mm-hmm.
Ask about, get a second opinion sometimes. Ask about alternatives to the recommended treatment, not to demand and insist and protest whatever you're being told, but to learn about alternatives. Not everyone's given all the alternatives. And employers are generally getting ripped off on their health insurance benefits by their consultants. There's a group of very good consultants who are transparent and honest fiduciaries. It's very hard for a business to know how to navigate that, but I provide a lot of tools for that in the book, The Price We Pay. But employers are getting ripped off on health insurance. That's a big way to reduce healthcare costs and change the system. And then in terms of doctors, there's a lot of doctors that are incredibly honest and demonstrate humility. And when they will tell you, I don't know, I'm going to ask a colleague, I don't know, I'll read up on this. I don't know, this is an interesting podcast you send me. I'll listen to it. People in the world of GI and cancer care, they're coming to me with all kinds of ideas that sound crazy. But instead of labeling them as crazy and ignoring them, I need to listen to them and maybe I can learn something. And that's the general demeanor that I think people should seek when they seek medical care.
I ask this of every guest. I know we're coming to a close. We call this show Dad Saves America because I think as a man, as a father, this is the role we can play that helps our family, but also our community and the country. In all your work, in everything you do, how do you see your role in the American story?
Well, I think the American culture is based on the general value of honesty and transparency, hard work, and an ethos that promotes a community. In the United States, we tend to have individual rights that supersede community rights. And a lot of times that makes sense, but you can't not forget about the community. And I think we live in a world of increasing isolation, depression, social isolation. It kills older folks. I've seen it. And so, whatever we can do to promote communities is something that I'm a big believer in. So, dialogues, friendships, communities, the work you're doing are all things that I'm excited to watch, be a part of, chip into. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but I am super excited about so many things in society right now. Enough people are waking up, light bulbs are getting turned on. And we're seeing people now saying, this is broken. We need to start over. We should be doing this differently. A generation of young people are saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this system. I want to do it differently. We've all been blindsided. My students now, they say, we don't want to have a house in the suburbs. We want to live in very small little settings and live in the community. We thought that there would be one mega hospital in every state. When Hillary Clinton was working on healthcare, all the experts said there's going to be mega medical centers and everybody will just come into them.
Sort of Kaiser Permanente for all.
Yeah, and was also sort of a master mothership hospital, and everyone travels 500 miles to get there.
If you got a head injury, that plan sure doesn't pass the sniff test, but okay.
Yeah, and the idea was everyone feeds into these.
Yeah.
Every expert's predicted it. Every expert was wrong. And the reason every expert was wrong is they underestimated the value of America's communities. They like having their community hospital and their community docs and nurses, and they like having that sense of community. And if you look at the trends in society right now, there's this sort of trend to now go back to how can we live less in isolation and more in communities? Shared businesses, shared car rides, shared everything. I mean, we live in a new shared economy, and that is, I think, because people are hungry for community.
Dr. Marty, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Great to be with you, John. Thanks for having me.